reach the 9:30. Thank you. And welcome to those of you who are joining us on Zoom. Deborah will be monitoring the chat. So if anybody has a question, just throw it on the chat and she will take it from there. All right, so we have an interesting text in front of us today. It's the companion piece to what we have read last week. You all will know this reference. It is the rest of the story, right? This isn't something that just stops at a good moment and stays there. It will move on. So I think what I'd like to do on the back of your handout is today's text, but I think I want to circle back to verse 16 and just give us a running start into today's text. Originally, this is one big story. I broke it up because we're just trying to take it piece by piece during the season of Lent. But that's a little bit of an inauthentic imposition on the story. So I'll read starting verse 16. When Jesus came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captive and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say to them, "Today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious word that came from his mouth. They said, "Is this not Joseph's son?" He said to them, "Doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, 'Doctor, cure yourself.' And you will say, 'Do here also in your hometown the things that we have heard you did at Capernaum.'" And he said, "Truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown. But the truth is, there were many widows in Israel in the time of Elijah, when the heaven was shut up for 3 years and 6 months, and there was a severe famine over all the land. Yet Elijah was sent to none of them except to a widow at Zarephath in Sidon. There were also many lepers in Israel at the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them was cleansed except Naaman the Syrian. When they heard this, all in the synagogue were filled with rage. They got up, drove him out of the town, led him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they might hurl him off the cliff. But he passed through the midst of them and went on his way. This ends the reading. Oh, yeah. Okay. So in the video that I made on Monday, I really focused more on Jesus' words and the question of what happened between last week's reading and this week's reading. That you go from the language of the 22nd verse, all spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came out of his mouth, saying, "Is this not Joseph's son?" Right? The difference between that verse, the tone of that verse, and pushing him off the brow of the hill on which the town is built. I have come to think lately, and I don't know if I'm right at all. Beryl, you've probably been to Nazareth, you can tell me, but my suspicion is this is more of an excommunication than an execution. I don't want to think we're taking them to the top of the Rocky Mountains and watching them fall down into the Grand Canyon or something.
It is literally a cliff. I mean, and it just so happens that the valley is way below. It is not the Rocky Mountains, but it would be a severe.
It would be severe. All right, that's good to hear. Yes, sir.
One of the commentaries I read said that stonings often took place from the ones throwing the stone to the person being
Right.
at a lower level.
Oh, so this might have been precipitating a stone.
Yeah, that was a
Yeah.
suggestion this person made.
As diabolical as it is, it's clever, right? Scientifically clever. You get gravity working on your side, put somebody at the bottom of a pit, and then your stones pick up a little momentum as they go down. Not that I'm recommending that for anybody, but yeah, so it's pretty severe one way or another. And the community seems to turn on a dime. Okay, so let's I want to ask, let me just ask you a couple of questions. Have you ever experienced, either in your own heart or in the room, somebody else, someone going from one extreme to the other, from either what seemed like utter joy to falling apart? I mean, what does it take for people to go from some semblance of calm and joy and goodness, welcome and acceptance, to suddenly being somewhat vicious? How does that work? Just maybe you read about it, maybe you've seen it on television, maybe you were in the room, maybe it's happened in your heart. You don't have to disclose everything. But what happens? Have you seen that happen? You've seen it in an instant? Or
Yes.
over time?
I happened to be in the free speech area at UCSD when the chancellor came out. Previously very well respected, and a student body president said to me, if Bill McGill stands up and says, this is what happens when the irrationality carries the day, because there had been a immolation the previous Wednesday. If Bill McGill stands up and says, this is what happens when irrationality carries the day, I personally will dig up one of these stones and plant it in his forehead.
Wow.
It seems to me, if I remember, it happens often when it comes to politics. Even more than religion.
Yeah. So, and if that's the case, is Jesus getting political, or is he being strictly religious? He's talking about oppression, in prison, or he's meddling, as it were. Yeah, that's a good observation. Yes, sir.
You can turn all of those three things, the oppression, the blind, and so forth, and turn them into the Roman Empire oppressing the Jews and keeping them poor and keeping them in line.
Right.
So I can read it that way without any difficulty at all.
Yeah.
And I agree. I had more politic issues than religious issues.
Yeah.
I lost a very good friend for that.
Yeah, I think many of us have over the last few years, because I think we've all been radicalized. And the people with whom we disagree have been radicalized, and we can see it. What in the world is wrong with them? But we ourselves perhaps have been radicalized too, to where we're a little less tolerant of them because they've been wrong all along, if we stop and think about it. You know, that kind of thing. Yeah, I think that does happen, right? The stakes get kind of ramped up, and when they do, we can't see a way of abiding one another very well. That's interesting. Let me, Jerome, you just brought up something I think we want to hold for a minute. So when Jesus talks about the poor, those who are imprisoned, the oppressed, brokenhearted, and proclaiming the year of the Lord's favor, how do we read that? I grew up in a tradition that more or less spiritualizes all of it. Like, I may not be financially poor, but I'm poor in spirit because I'm humble. I may not be oppressed by the Roman Empire, but sometimes I feel a lot of pressure to cheat on my taxes, and I really shouldn't do that. And the oppression. I mean, honestly, but the tradition where I grew up, all of those terms, I think there was at first an assumption that everything in the Bible has to apply to us. And that's an interesting assumption. I don't know that it's true. I never heard a pastor stand up and say, this isn't about you. It's about them. It's about your enemy. It's about this. It's not about you. So when you have this sense that everything in the Bible is about us, when that sense is also a little bit driven by the idea that everything's a test, you better get it right. I mean, we had that anxiety that we had to get all of this right. So then you look at the scriptures as being about me and what I need to do. What do I need to do? The bottom line, every single reading of scripture, when you're in that movement, and I don't know that that's what the writers are writing about all the time. So one way of reading this is to spiritualize it, make it about our internal battles, our internal oppression, our inability to see, not literally, but spiritual things. I think that's a real tendency that a large part of Christianity have, is to take terms that actually we know the terms because they have political and economic meaning, but then spiritualize them so they're about us. And the way to get over it is to pray more and study your Bible more and be a better Christian. That's one way of reading it. Am I communicating? I mean, does that make sense? Have you heard people do that? In some respects, that may be what Matthew does with Luke's Sermon on the Plain, when Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor," and Matthew writes, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." We might be seeing that tendency already in the late first century. Another way of reading it is to read it politically, right? But through this lens, we're the oppressed. We're the ones who are struck down by the Roman Empire. And when I say we, I'm talking about Jesus' audience, right? They might have heard it politically. And of course, the oppressor would be the Roman Empire. And the third way I think that they possibly could have heard this was politically, but they're the provocateur, not the victim. So everybody in the room probably could have said they're oppressed because of the Roman Empire. Everybody in the room probably could have said they needed liberation because they were living under the empire. But not everybody in the room was equally suffering. And some people in the room were putting it to other people in the room. And not everybody in the room was blind. And not everybody in the room was in prison. I'm going to conjecture that most of the imprisonment at this time is debtor's prison, more than somebody having blatantly broken the law. And so another way of hearing it is that it's literal, it is political, it is economic, but we've seen the enemy, and they're us, not the empire. And now you're meddling, right? That's when people start getting pretty upset. So let me just give you an example. I'm not preaching this week, so I won't say this from the pulpit, but just between us. It's one thing to talk about racism and to think about slave owners and those Southern Dixiecrats who instituted Jim Crow law, and those awful restaurateurs who separated races at the lunch counter, people who wanted separation of schools. It's one thing to talk about racism and to see that and to tut that and to say that was bad, should never have happened. another thing to talk about racism and to say that literally everyone in this room has benefited in some way by racism. And if for nothing else, then we weren't disqualified automatically from a job or from buying housing or from a neighborhood simply because of the color of our skin. You say that to some white folk, if you use the word privilege or the phrase white privilege, that you can be sure the first thing they're going to say is, I worked hard, right? Because it sounds like you're challenging their story and their own challenges and genuine hard work. That's not what the phrase white privilege means. And that's not what the phrase systemic racism means. So if you talk about systemic racism, the first response from white people will always be, I'm not a racist. And in their hearts, they may not be. But that's not what systemic racism is talking about. There are different ways of hearing the same language. And if you're in a defensive posture, you'll hear it in a way that you can rationally defend yourself. I'll bet each person in here can give me good examples to prove that you are personally not a racist. And I wouldn't argue with you. I think you're probably not. But that's not what systemic racism is talking about. And so when we hear the term racism, or even the phrase systemic racism, and our initial response is, I'm not a racist. But we're hearing it in one respect when it's meant in the other. So I wonder if something like that, I don't want to discuss that right now, but I want to say something that's a little itchy for us, so you can get a sense of what it might have felt like to be sitting in that room and to hear Jesus using these loaded terms, politically loaded terms of his day. Even if they're from the Bible, he's reading them and then says, this day, today, this scripture is being fulfilled as you hear it. What did he just do? What did he just do, right? And how in fact are they hearing it? Are they hearing it in the sense that it was meant? In the sense that it was written? Are they hearing it in a defensive way? Because that will make us mad. It does make us mad. Yeah.
Well, in a sense, and I don't think I've ever read it this way before, and I appreciate the way that you opened up this passage in the video that you sent out. That really helpful. But I now see that in a sense he's a provocateur. It could be read that way in this passage, right? And so no wonder, I think that's where you're sort of what you're implying, that it could be read that way.
Right. So the words themselves that Jesus read from Isaiah, they've always been there, and these people have heard them 100 times, right? The only thing Jesus adds to it, I mean, Jesus does a couple of things. He reads mostly from Isaiah 61, then he throws in that reference about the year of the Lord's favor from Isaiah 58. But the only unique thing Jesus says here is today, this scripture is being fulfilled as you hear it. So we know, if nothing else, he's not allowing them to say, this is back in biblical days. This is back in the old days. He's telling them this is the present reality being addressed. It's not yet clear how that makes it provocative, but I do think if you look closely at verse 22 and consider the decision that translators have to make on this verse, this is the linchpin for me. If the translators that we're using make the right judgment, and they're doing their best, and I honor them, and they're smarter than I. If they make the right judgment, then everybody's speaking well of Jesus. They're amazed at the gracious words, And they asked, is this not Joseph's son? With that setup, that almost sounds like they're really proud as peach over this local boy. Just a minute, please. Let me finish my thought. Okay, so if you read verse 22, taking the translation judgment that our translation has made, then it sounds like Jesus then turns everything in the next verse. And I use a phrase, put a stick in the spoke and just watch the bike crash. But I want to argue that verse 22 could be read differently. Remember, the phrase all spoke well of him. The word well is an interpretation, not a translation. The word for good or well is not in that sentence. This is the translator's judgment call, that they are speaking approvingly. All Luke says is all spoke of, they were talking about him. So that could be, in and of itself, could be good or bad. I mean, they could be turning around and saying, what the hell does this guy think he is, right? They could be speaking about him in that respect.
Mm-hmm.
The translators feel like it's positive, and for good reason. They were amazed. Amazed. I kept using the Greek word thaumazo. It's used many times, a lot of times very approvingly, and other times as a shocking, astounded would be a better translation. The gracious words that come from his mouth, it could be translated words of grace. In other words, Jesus is talking about grace to the oppressed, the blind. Could be that Jesus is extending grace to others. And that's astounding to them. And if you take out the word well, if you change the word amazed into astounded, and if you understand that they weren't necessarily gracious words, but they were words about grace, that this, I'm going to take a view here, that this upstart is telling us actually applies to other people. Then you can start to hear that verse 22 might be a real expression of indignation already. Not that they're going to be incensed, but they're already like, we didn't ask you to stand up and give us this crap. I'm trying to use nice language here because one ought, but I think they were angry enough not to use nice language. So, but I need to qualify that it could be translated exactly as we read it. And this could be a very positive moment that suddenly gets turned around because Jesus says, I'm not here for you, I'm here for others. Or they could already be mad. And that's why Jesus says, yeah. Now you're going to say to me, so listen, heal yourself. Do hear what you did in other places. I'm not here for you. You know, it could be that Jesus' response to them is a genuine response, not a provocative one, that they're already. Do you see my point? I'm beating it, Steph. I'm sorry. Yes.
Well, I think I've always had the sense that Jesus sticks his thumb in their eye by the two Old Testament references.
Yeah, now that follows for sure. But that follows. What I'm trying to say
that's
is
part of the
where
milieu.
what?
I think that's part of the milieu of this moment.
Well, it could be, but if the question is Jesus provoking this, or are they already mad? Then that follows. That yes, that is true. The reference to Elijah and Elisha is provocative too, very provocative. But I want to honor the flow of the story. Before we get to that, something's already happened. And either they were mad and Jesus is responding, or they weren't mad and Jesus is provoking. I think those are your two choices here. And it all depends on how you read verse 22. So, yes, Deborah.
I want to get to a comment. Adriana said it's not provocative. He's stating he is God. It's just not easy to understand, accept.
Yeah, Adriana, I don't know if that's the theology genuinely being reflected in this story. Jesus has been declared the Son of God at his baptism. Jesus has been tested as the Son of God. To declare Jesus to be God is a later development in theology that I don't want to impose on the text that hasn't gone there at this point. I'm not seeing in the story quite that, but I am seeing something similar to that. So I appreciate you making that point. Jesus read from Isaiah a text that begins, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me." Luke begins the sojourn into Nazareth by saying Jesus is full of the Spirit. So I think Jesus is making an emphatic declaration that what he's preaching, what he's representing, what he's doing is an expression of the Spirit of the Lord, and not just of a hometown boy, not just his own personal opinion, and not just another, charismatic, popular speaker, but this is coming from God. So in that respect, absolutely, I agree with you, Adriana, that Jesus is claiming divine imprimatur on what he's doing. And if they don't like what he's doing, guess what that says to them? Right? To be opposed to this is to be opposed to what the Spirit is doing, and in fact, opposed to the work of God.
I
And
agree.
yeah, so that's, thank you. I think that's a really important point to make as well. All right, so let me ask you, how do you read it? I mean, do you read this as they're already a little ticked off and Jesus just leans into that because he understands where their anger is coming from and it's coming from the wrong place and he's not going to suffer that? Or are they initially really happy? I mean, the New Revised Standard Version in most translations interpret verse 22 positively. I would almost have to throw out this caveat: you might trust them more than you trust my reading of it. I read it differently, and I've been wrong before. I'm often wrong. So how do you read it? Are they already turning, or does Jesus provoke it in verse 23?
Jesus provokes it in the sense that he's getting ready to tell them the reports that you have been getting, what has been reported, say, from Capernaum, are inaccurate.
Inaccurate?
A misunderstanding of what I represent.
All right, help me understand that.
Well,
yeah.
And you will say, do here also in your hometown the things that we have heard you did at Capernaum. Their understanding that is in part based upon hearsay.
Right.
Not just what they heard today, but what they heard previously,
Right.
Which is hearsay. They weren't in Capernaum.
Right.
What did he say in Capernaum? How is it being reported? Is it being reported accurately? If the passage can be interpreted as political or spiritual, or different kinds of oppression, or different people who may think they are oppressed,
Right.
then he's getting ready to tell them, I'm going to correct your understanding. Prophets are misunderstood in their home community. They're never accepted in their hometown because we say things they don't want to hear, in
Right.
part because we've been misunderstood. And
Huh.
then he tells these two stories about historical
Right,
situations. Where the people who benefited from the grace of God were not those who were expected to benefit.
right.
So I think he's saying, I'm here to correct your misimpressions.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so the news that they heard, we don't know exactly how they hear it, whether it's accurate or not. We know how.
Right.
But we do know that it's already mentioned.
Right.
In this story, right?
Right.
So verse 14, then Jesus, filled with the power of the Spirit, returned to Galilee, and a report about him spread throughout all the surrounding region or country. Yeah. Accurate or not, that's where the report started. And now one thing you're wondering, David, is whether when the Nazarene people heard that report, whether they heard it accurately or understood it accurately.
Understood it accurately.
And that Jesus is trying to correct that. What would strengthen that is the fact that he sits in the synagogue, which is what teachers do.
Yeah.
So he's sitting in the synagogue saying, today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. Not altogether sure that prophets were great teachers. They did have school, they did proclaim, I'm not altogether sure that the rejection of prophets is a difference of agreement as much as something a little more than that. But certainly at the heart of it, there's a different view that people have. There's a difference between you and that neighbor that drives you crazy, right? You just fundamentally see things differently. And so there is kind of an educational component at the heart of it. But there's also, I think, a transformational component. That someone has to be willing to let go of something in order to embrace something. I think that, when CEOs get caught doing wrong thing with their employees, you ever notice that the way they get punished is they have to go through a sensitivity training course? And I mean, I love education, but education is not the problem here. It's not that they don't understand you're not supposed to walk out of your bathroom with your pants down when your secretary is in the room. I mean, their third grade child could tell them that. So I think education and transformation are two intertwined things that are not quite the same, but have to rely on each other. So I'm with you. I think I'm with you in some respects. I think the prophets do want to educate, but I also think they're calling for a change of heart, which means that your difference of opinion is not like, everybody's got an opinion. Could be one way or another. It's more like when you speak in the name of the Lord, you're saying what's right. And if someone has a difference of opinion, then they are wrong. That's kind of the sense you get from the prophets, which is why they're so, people love to hurt them and get rid of them and kill them if they have to, because they're not very tolerant of other opinions. Because they're convicted that they're speaking on behalf of the Lord. So that's interesting, David. I think that's really helpful to kind of remember that there is, these folks have been reading Isaiah all of their lives. So there really is a fixed understanding of what that means. And now you're hearing it kind of presented in a different way. And you might think, well, that's just wrong, they're doing more than just arguing with him in the end.
Yeah.
But that could be the beginning of it. Sure. That's interesting.
I agree with your assessment of it, and it finally made this Bible passage make sense to me because I never understood it before. But knowing that Luke didn't actually use the word well, and that it could very well be that the crowd was responding to the analogy of the white privilege, saying white privilege nowadays makes perfect sense to me, and it's completely in line with Luke's Jesus to me. Betty says that she's inclined to think that the hometown people started with positive impression of Jesus.
started with a positive. Betty, are you referring to verse 22 or are you referring to before that?
She cites Luke 2:52 previous to that.
Yeah. Yeah, so at the end of Luke's second chapter, Jesus and family are back. He's growing up with favor. So yeah, and I tried to emphasize last Sunday, I think there was some buzz about this. I think Luke is very clear in the way he describes Jesus' return, that Jesus is a product of Nazareth, and that is a good thing. All of these customs, habits, and so forth that Jesus had that shaped him in many ways, that he received from Nazareth, are good.
But
But what?
I've always had the sense that there's a note of skepticism afloat in all of this. Is this not Joseph's son?
Right, let's talk about that. Yeah, that's any reference to Jesus' family is an interesting thing. Okay, it's interesting on two levels. It's interesting biblically, and it's interesting for those of us who now have a developed theology about Jesus. And for example, is this not Joseph's son? Well, a modern Christian would say, no, it's not. Didn't you read the first story? Jesus was, Mary was, had the Immaculate Conception. I suspect that first story was added later to what starts in chapter 3. There are lots of reasons why I suspect that, and of course, anytime I suspect something, I could be dead wrong. It doesn't appear that when they ask, is this not Joseph's son? Jesus' answer is, my mother was immaculately conceived. This child, no, don't say that about my mom. Jesus doesn't, and nobody through the rest of Luke or Acts appeals to the birth narrative to prove anything. You just need to know that. Nobody in Matthew appeals to the visit from the Magi to say Jesus is really wealthy because he got a lot of gold when he was born. Those stories seem to be added later, and they are not the substance of argument throughout Luke or Matthew. Okay, so the question is not Joseph's son. I think a lot of us read it as challenging the divinity of Christ. I'm not sure if that's how it is in Luke's gospel. Could be. I just, it doesn't seem to be to me. But what is that question? I can hear that a couple of different ways, right? You can hear it rather heartwarming. I remember when he was just a child, he was right here. Isn't he one of ours? And look at this marvelous teaching coming out of his mouth. If you read verse 22 positively, that's real positive. They are taking pride in one of their own. It's your community college winning the NCAA tournament, right? And you're like, I used to go when there were 10 people in the crowd, right? You just have that feeling of his success is on. Or you can hear it as an upstart question. Who's this guy think he is? I wiped his butt when he was little, right? Who do you think he is saying that to me? He's just Joseph's son. There's nothing special about these people. Where does he get off talking about this? We know they have problems. You ever heard about their family? Yeah, it's real easy to. So it's easy to hear that question positively or negatively. I know a lot of sermons that I've seen on this text. They read verse 22 positively up until that question. And then they read that question as the provocative part. Oh, now they're trying to dismiss and just make him nothing but Joseph's son, when he just told them the Spirit of the Lord is coming. And, bringing someone down to size makes it easier to disprove it. And so but I think those sermons are trying to prevent making Jesus the provocateur or making the home crowd angry already. But so that's an interesting question. This is not Joseph's son. A lot of your reading of the story depends on how you hear that. Any other comment or question? Deborah, anything else in the chat? No.
Not about-
Beryl. Oh, I'm sorry, Kat.
A different take. I'm sure all of you at some point said, oh, you're Kathleen's daughter or something. And I think maybe Jesus resented the fact they didn't accept him on his own.
Hmm.
And when they said, why don't you do a miracle for us? He could have, but that wouldn't prove anything. They weren't accepting him other than he's Joseph's son. So he chose not to do a miracle in front of them just to get him.
Boy, you sound more and more like me all the time. Thank you. I'm going to quit praying to be like Jesus and say, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting thing. It's like, are they, by virtue of asking this question, kind of dismissing what Jesus in fact is and just categorizing him as Joseph's son, to which Jesus says, and so it's Jesus,
I'm my own person.
right. So it's Jesus and not them that says, surely you will say to me, do here what you did there. And if that is genuinely what they're thinking, you're right. Maybe that just makes him dig in and say, no, I'm not going to be your puppet master, your magician, your traveling freak show. I'm gonna to demand that, like we get equal time, is to miss the purpose of what Jesus was really up to. He was really liberating people. We're gonna see in the next story what those moments look like that this is referring to. Yes, sir.
I kind of wonder, why Luke puts this in here in the first place. Is it to point up the contrast with what he was willing to do, healing, etc., in Capernaum, and not do it in Nazareth, and kind of make a point of that, but realizing that this is post-resurrection, this is even probably post-Paul's work to go out beyond the confines of the
Right.
At least. Is Luke put it in there to kind of prepare and point out that the word and is going to go beyond not only the hometown but beyond the area of
Right.
Judea and Israel.
Yeah.
It is kind of a strange place, strange story in a strange place.
Yeah. So I hope you folks on the Zoom were able to hear that. That's an excellent comment. Let's imagine. So biblical scholars like to ask, what is the Sitzenleben of a story? Sitzenleben is a German phrase, so obviously it means we're smarter than non-biblical scholars. But it just means the situation in life. And the assumption is that when Luke is writing this, he's addressing a situation that people are facing, or maybe be it a question, a theological conundrum, something like that. So what might a story like this be addressing? In Luke's time, much less in ours, but initially in Luke's time. So it could be a couple of things. I did suggest at the end of the video that maybe Luke is giving us a sense of why it is that the Christian movement really flowered outside of Israel. Right? No prophet is acceptable in his homeland. Maybe that's true of Jesus in Nazareth, but maybe it's also true of the message of Jesus among his people in Israel. But somehow, when you get out to the Mediterranean and even Rome, you suddenly have these expansive growth. And maybe Luke is kind of sowing the ground for that. if you begin with the assumption that Luke wrote both Luke and Acts, that makes a lot of, that could be possible. Another is, you know, it's almost a mark of validation for prophets that they're rejected. Almost, not quite. I mean, I think Isaiah was pretty much a court prophet. So I don't want to assume that every prophet got thrown into a pit. But here's my challenge for you. Get yourself a nice concordance, either the one in the back of your Bible, or go to the conference room in our administrative building and grab one of those gigantic concordances.
Or online.
Or online. And look at how the word prophet shows up in Luke's gospel. Okay? And look how Jesus treats prophets. I mean, it's going to be well. Jesus will treat them well. But and the reason I'm asking you to do this is because I can't remember exactly. Sorry, I'm just admitting to you that I'm putting this on you because I didn't do it. I think it's in Luke's gospel that Jesus makes reference. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets who are sent. From the blood of Abel. Nobody called Abel a prophet before now. Certainly a martyr, because he offered an offering that was pleasing to God, where Cain's offering was not, and out of jealousy, Cain murdered Abel. So Luke and Jesus in Luke's gospel, I think, is tapping into a tradition that the martyrs are martyrs because they're prophets. Not because they said anything, not because they told the future, not because their words are recorded, but because they were martyred. It meant that they were speaking truth to power, to use our current phrase, and the sign of the martyr is rejection. And that explains, number one, why Jesus is rejected, particularly by the religious leaders, even though it's terribly popular among the populace. And number two, why Jesus is killed. Because the reference to the prophets there is murdered people who are put to death. So part of what might be happening here, Beryl, is that this is a way of identifying Jesus within that prophetic tradition. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. And to extend the first idea you had, maybe that's how Luke sees the early church. I mean, Paul gets beaten up, stoned, and left for dead, ultimately executed in Rome. Stephen, one of the newly elected deacons of the church in chapter 6 of Acts, is stoned to death in chapter 7. James is put to death in chapter 12. And it pleases the religious leaders in Jerusalem so much that Herod starts arresting others. There is that sense that the early church is treated like the prophets in the book of Acts. And, you know, even though Paul will stand up and make these tremendous defenses of his gospel preaching to people like Agrippa, who ended up being Caesar later, and Bernice, his wife, and Porcius Festus, the Roman leader with the worst name ever. Even though Paul makes speeches to them, each one of them says, this man is innocent and should not die. He still dies, right? Because that's the prophets are not guilty of committing crime, but they're put to death anyway. So it could be that maybe what Luke is doing here is sowing a prophetic tradition, that to be a disciple of Jesus and in the tradition of Jesus is to be the prophetic church, which means that the empire is never going to accept us. And the religious elite will never accept that. And I use us rather loosely, don't I? Isn't that something? If you imagine that, let's say, if we were reading this text through Howard Thurman's book, and in his second chapter, Howard Thurman cites Luke chapter 4, verses 16 through 18. Then what Jesus is doing is aligning himself with the disinherited. And if that's true of Jesus then that's still true of Jesus now. And so the gospel is for those whose backs are against the wall. And then those of us in the room whose backs are not against the wall suddenly feel offended because we need it to be about us. Does that make sense? Think about that. Our prayer of confession on Sunday is kind of going to try to go there for us. What does it feel like? What might it have felt like to imagine that the good news went to the poor, but we're not really the poor? We want good news for ourselves. We'll get it eventually, but I think we get it most readily when we first accept that the good news is to the poor, not to us. And then we have to join at the margin. Does that mean we have to become poor? I don't know. It's a huge conversation. And we don't have time to have that conversation right now. I will leave it up to Sue Jean to answer all those questions this weekend when she's preaching. So Sue Jean, if you're listening, you go, girl. All right.
Mark, I
yeah.
think that's a false dilemma.
Do you?
Yes. I think, when we realize that the message is not for us, it doesn't mean we disagree with the truth of the message,
Right.
but we may not want to do or accept what would have to change to extend the message to those for whom it is intended.
I think the dilemma is real, but that's the way out. I agree with you. I fully look. It's probably never been clearer in our lifetime than it was with the advent of liberation theology, right? With liberation theology, you had initially Latin American theologians, later African theologians, and then later African American theologians, like James Cone and others, and then other groups. But it really started in Latin America, liberation theology, relying heavily on Luke chapter 4, that said the gospel has, this is their phrase, a preferential option for the poor. A preferential option for the poor. That phrase, which was written into an agreement in Colombia among Latin American theologians, and I want to put it somewhere around 1972, might have been late 60s, was fighting words.
Oh, yes.
Fighting words everywhere, especially in the Roman Catholic Church. Archbishop Romero in El Salvador was never on the right side of Pope John Paul II. Never. When he was appointed archbishop, it was before he came to embrace liberation theology. One of his best friends named Rutilio Grande was a liberation theologian, and Grande was murdered after leaving a community where he was helping to establish a clinic. And that was a turning point in Archbishop Romero's life, to where he began embracing liberation theology. And he was corrected, he was threatened, he was censured by the Roman Catholic hierarchy on many occasions for what he was doing. He chose not to live in the Archbishop residence, but to live at a cancer hospital among Carmelite nuns and other workers in San Salvador. And it was him So he was fighting on the one hand, the corruption of his own government. And the war that was unfolding. And on the other hand, against his own hierarchy. And that's why there's a photograph. It's an iconic photograph. So after Archbishop Romero was assassinated, he was first buried right there on the grounds where his apartment was at the cancer hospital. And later they made a crypt for him at the cathedral in San Salvador. And so his remains were moved there. There's a picture of Pope John II. Am I getting his number right? Anyway, John Paul II, kneeling in front of the crypt where Romero's remains are. And almost every poor church in El Salvador has a poster with that picture on it. They say, he finally got it. He finally honored the person who was right, who spoke for us. I don't know if he did get it. Sometimes we do things that are politically very helpful. But liberation theology became kind of the fighting ground between the established church and what were called base communities, small villages, and that really started finding their voice and started really fighting against hierarchy and starting to expect that the Spirit poured out among everybody, and everybody has gifts. And someone in the community can be a delegate of the word or a health promoter. Doesn't have to be someone in town who comes to help. It was really a wholesale change of approach, and it was fought tooth and nail by the establishment. Always will be. So what Jesus is facing here, I think within our own time, you can see a fairly interesting representation of it. You have a comment?
There's a comment from Adriana. I don't believe that the message is not for us. I believe the message is for everyone. There is a difference between material needs and spiritual needs, but they are both needs. The Lord's redemption needs both. But that only relates to the physical work of justice. It does not relate to salvation.
Yeah, again, Adriana, I'm not sure that I see the physical work of justice and salvation. I don't see them as two separate things. And I think salvation for some people is liberation from their real chain, and salvation for some people is liberation from their presumption that put those chains in place. So we may not be saying different things, but we're saying it differently. Look, to say salvation is for everybody is undoubtedly true. I'm a universalist. I think it will ultimately be for everybody in a real way. I certainly feel that the call to salvation is for everybody. I think the promise of salvation is for everybody. Objectively, the call to salvation is for everybody. Subjectively, some people are in a place to hear it better than others. And a lot of that depends on where you sit when it comes to the spectrum of power and privilege influence in the world. Objectively, true for everybody, no question. Subjectively, not everybody is able to hear it. So why faith is a gift. That's how we call it in the Presbyterian Church. Faith is a gift from God. You need God's gift to embrace the call of the gospel. It's not just you evaluating your options and making the choice based on your own smarts. It's a gift. Okay, we're really out of
Which is
time.
exactly why I think your interpretation of verse 22 makes perfect sense. That's exactly why.
All right, thank you. So Adriana, thanks for your comments. Everybody, thanks for joining us on the Zoom. Thanks for everybody in the room. We'll do it again next week. Jen will be making the Monday morning video and leading our Wednesday discussion next week. So y'all come and glean her wisdom. Thank you. So Ann, you can turn off the recording now.
Okay.